The certified letter from the Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association landed in Thomas Chen's mailbox with the subtlety of a hand grenade. He knew what it contained before he even broke the seal. Rejection, wrapped in bureaucratic language and legal threats. Thomas stood in his driveway, squinting against the late afternoon sun as he scanned the document, his jaw tightening with each pompous paragraph. Application for driveway expansion denied. 3 months of architectural drawings, municipal permit applications, and contractor quotes, all reduced to a single dismissive word. The letter went on to cite HOA bylaw 7.32 regarding preservation of neighborhood aesthetic continuity and maintenance of green space ratios. Thomas snorted. What the letter didn't mention was Board President Margaret Wellington's personal vendetta against anything that didn't conform to her 1990s vision of suburban perfection. At 42, Thomas had spent 15 years as a structural engineer, designing solutions for seemingly impossible architectural challenges. He retrofitted century-old buildings to withstand earthquakes and had consulted on some of the most innovative high-rises in Singapore. Yet here he was defeated by 5 retirees who constituted the Oak Ridge Heights HOA board. Bad news, called a voice from across the street. Thomas looked up to see his neighbor Elijah walking over. The retired mechanical engineer had become Thomas's closest friend in the neighborhood after moving in 3 years ago. The HOA rejected my driveway expansion, Thomas replied, waving the letter. Apparently, I'm threatening the neighborhood aesthetic continuity by wanting to park my cars in my own damn driveway instead of on the street. Elijah chuckled sympathetically. Margaret's at it again, I see. She rejected my application for solar panels last year. Said they were visually destructive. Thomas folded the letter and shoved it into his pocket. His 3-car family had outgrown their 2-car driveway. His daughter Mai had just turned 16 and received her license, adding another vehicle to their household. Between his Tesla, his wife Sophia's SUV, and now May's used Civic, someone was always parking on the street, a violation of another HOA rule during winter snow emergencies. I just don't understand the logic, Thomas said, gesturing toward his house. We have the space. I'm willing to pay for it. It would actually look better than having cars parked on the street, but no. According to Margaret, I'm trying to turn Oak Ridge Heights into a parking lot. Elijah nodded, his eyes suddenly lighting up with the spark of an idea. You know, Thomas, there are always alternative solutions. What do you mean? Well, you're a structural engineer. I used to design hydraulic systems for a living. The HOA can control what happens above ground, but Elijah trailed off, a mischievous smile forming. Thomas stared at his neighbor, the implication slowly dawning on him. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Come over for a beer tonight after dinner. I've got some sketches from a project I worked on in Germany back in the 90s. Completely different application, but the principles are the same. As Elijah walked away, Thomas looked down at his driveway with new eyes. Where moments ago he had seen rejection and frustration, he now saw possibility, a challenge worthy of his expertise. That evening, as Thomas pulled into his too small driveway, forcing Sophie to park her SUV on the street again, he made a decision. The HOA had won this battle, but the war was far from over. If Margaret Wellington and her Architectural Preservation Committee wouldn't let him expand horizontally, perhaps it was time to think vertically. Thomas smiled to himself as he entered his house, already mentally calculating load-bearing requirements and hydraulic specifications. The rejection letter that had ruined his afternoon now felt like the beginning of something much more interesting than a simple driveway expansion. Elijah's basement resembled a cross between a mad scientist's laboratory and a retired engineer's man cave. Vintage drafting tables stood alongside modern computer setups, while the walls were adorned with framed patents and technical diagrams from a lifetime of innovation. Thomas settled into a well-worn leather chair as Elijah rummaged through a filing cabinet. Here we are, Elijah announced triumphantly, pulling out a large tube. He unfurled the blueprints across his drafting table with the reverence of a historian handling an ancient scroll. I worked on this parking system for a luxury apartment building in Munich back in '94. Space was at a premium, so we designed an underground garage with hydraulic lifts. The residents could park their cars on these platforms at street level, press a button, and the car would descend into the underground garage. Thomas leaned forward, his engineer's mind already analyzing the mechanics. This is brilliant, Elijah, but how would we adapt it for a residential driveway? That's where you come in, my friend. Elijah tapped the side of his nose. I know hydraulics and mechanical systems. You understand structural engineering and load-bearing calculations. For the next 3 hours, they hunched over the drafting table, sketching modifications and arguing technical specifications. By the time Thomas glanced at his watch, it was nearly midnight and a rough blueprint for a residential hydraulic car elevator had taken shape. The beauty of it, Elijah explained, is that when the platform is raised, it looks identical to a normal driveway. Same concrete finish, same dimensions. Margaret and her aesthetic police would never know the difference. But what about permits? Thomas asked. The city will require inspections, especially for something this complex. Elijah smiled slyly. Remember Dave Johnson? He used to work as the city's chief building inspector before he retired. He lives 3 streets over, plays poker with me every Thursday. You think he'd help us navigate the permit process without tipping off the HOA? For the chance to stick it to Margaret Wellington, he'd probably volunteer to dig the pit himself. Elijah laughed. She rejected his application for a backyard greenhouse 2 years ago, called it an unsightly commercial structure. Thomas realized he wasn't just designing a solution to his parking problem. He was joining a neighborhood resistance movement against HOA tyranny. The thought sent a thrill of rebellion through him that he hadn't felt since college. The next morning, Thomas called in sick to work. By noon, he had created detailed 3D models of the elevator system. By dinner, he had calculated material costs and structural requirements. The project would be expensive, roughly 3 times what the driveway expansion would have cost, but Thomas considered it an investment in both practical necessity and personal satisfaction. Sophia was initially skeptical when Thomas presented the plans over dinner. You wanted to build a secret underground parking space because Margaret Wellington said no to widening our driveway, she asked, eyebrow raised. It's not just about parking, Thomas replied. It's about not letting arbitrary rules dictate what we can and cannot do with our own property. Sophia studied the plans, her expression gradually shifting from doubt to intrigue. As the chief financial officer for a tech startup, she appreciated creative solutions to stubborn problems. You know what? Do it, she finally said. But on one condition. When it's finished, I want to see Margaret's face when my SUV seemingly vanishes into thin air. With Sophia's blessing secured, Thomas initiated what he and Elijah had codenamed Operation Vanishing Act. Over the next week, they assembled their team. Dave Johnston for permit guidance, Carlos Mendez, a contractor who despised the HOA after being fined for using the wrong shade of paint on his trim, and Lei Wei, Thomas's former colleague who specialized in hydraulic systems. The conspiracy grew with each meeting. What had begun as Thomas's personal vendetta evolved into a covert engineering project that united neighbors against a common adversary. As they finalized the plans in Elijah's basement, surrounded by technical diagrams and half-empty pizza boxes, Thomas felt a sense of camaraderie he hadn't experienced since his most challenging university projects. Remember, Dave cautioned during their final planning session, once we start digging, there's no turning back. If Margaret catches wind of this before the driveway section is back in place, she'll shut us down faster than you can say bylaw violation. Thomas looked around at his co-conspirators, a group of highly skilled professionals united by their disdain for petty regulations. We'll need to work fast, be discreet, and coordinate perfectly, he said. But if we pull this off, we'll have created something truly remarkable. As the meeting adjourned, Thomas couldn't help but smile at the irony. If the HOA had simply approved his reasonable request, they would have gotten an expanded driveway that matched neighborhood standards. Instead, their rejection had spawned an engineering marvel that would operate right under their noses, quite literally. Construction began on a Tuesday in early June, strategically timed to coincide with Margaret Wellington's 2-week Alaskan cruise. With the HOA's most vigilant watchdog temporarily out of the picture, Thomas and his team moved with military precision. Day 1 started before dawn. Carlos arrived with his crew in unmarked vans, parking several blocks away to avoid arousing suspicion. By 6 a.m., they had erected privacy screens around Thomas' property under the guise of landscape maintenance. Behind these screens, the real work began. We've got 13 days until the Wellington returns, Thomas reminded the crew. That means we need to excavate, build the shaft, install the hydraulic system, and restore the surface in less than 2 weeks. Carlos nodded confidently. My guys will work in shifts, round the clock if necessary. The excavation phase proved the most nerve-wracking. Using a combination of compact machinery and old-fashioned manual labor, they dug a 12-foot deep pit beneath Thomas's existing driveway. Every shovelful of dirt had to be quietly loaded into trucks and hauled away after dark. The neighbors on either side, both sympathetic to the cause, agreed to look the other way and ignore the occasional midnight rumble of departing vehicles. By day 4, the pit was complete, and Thomas felt his first surge of genuine optimism. That night, he descended into the cavernous space beneath his former driveway, his headlamp illuminating what would soon become his secret garage. What do you think? Elijah asked, joining him at the bottom. Thomas ran his hand along the reinforced concrete walls. It's magnificent. We're actually pulling this off. Days 5 through 8 were devoted to the structural work, reinforcing walls, pouring concrete, creating drainage systems, and installing the essential safety features. Lei Wei arrived from Seattle to oversee the installation of the hydraulic mechanisms, working with the precision of a surgeon as he connected hoses, calibrated pressure systems, and wired the control panels. "This is better than the system I designed for that Seattle high-rise," Lai commented on day 9 as they tested the hydraulic lift for the first time. The platform, identical in appearance to Thomas's original driveway section, rose silently and smoothly from the underground chamber, settling perfectly flush with the surrounding concrete. The neighbors who were in on the secret gathered to witness this first test, applauding softly when the platform locked into place. Even Dave Johnston, whose decades in building inspection had left him notoriously hard to impress, nodded in appreciation. "If I didn't know better," he said, "I'd never suspect there was anything under there." Days 10 and 11 were dedicated to finishing touches, weatherproofing the underground chamber, installing lighting, ventilation, and the subtle drainage system that would prevent flooding during heavy rains. Thomas added safety features beyond what building codes required, including backup power systems, emergency exit ladders, and sensors that would prevent the platform from descending if anything was detected on its surface. By day 12, the elevator was fully operational. The final step was to restore the landscaping and remove all evidence of construction. Carlos' team worked through the night, replacing sod, repositioning garden stones, and erasing tire tracks from the lawn. By dawn on day 13, Thomas' property looked exactly as it had 2 weeks earlier, with one invisible difference. That afternoon, the team gathered in Thomas' living room for a toast. The privacy screens had been removed, the construction equipment was gone, and not a single neighbor had filed an HOA complaint. Their secret project had remained, against all odds, a secret. To successful conspiracies, Elijah proposed, raising his glass. "And to parking solutions that Margaret Wellington will never know about," added Carlos with a grin. After everyone left, Thomas stood in his driveway with Sophia and May, staring at the seemingly ordinary concrete surface that concealed their extraordinary achievement. "Ready for the inaugural descent?" Thomas asked, handling Sophia his Tesla key fob. Sophia's eyes gleamed as she slid into the driver's seat. Positioned perfectly on the disguised platform, she pressed the small, discreet button that Thomas had installed in the car's center console. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a barely audible hydraulic hiss, a section of driveway beneath the Tesla began to sink. May filmed the process on her phone, capturing her mother's delighted expression as the car descended smoothly into the earth. In less than 30 seconds, the Tesla had vanished completely and the driveway platform, now empty, rose back into place, fitting so perfectly that even Thomas had to strain to detect the seams. "This is the coolest thing ever," May declared, already uploading the video to her private cloud storage. "Can my car go next?" Thomas laughed. "One car at a time. We don't want to attract attention by having cars mysteriously disappear in broad daylight." As if on cue, Thomas's phone chimed with a text from Elijah. "Margaret's flight lands tomorrow morning. Operation complete with 24 hours to spare." Thomas slipped his phone back into his pocket, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Phase 1, construction, was complete. Phase 2, keeping their underground garage a secret from the HOA, was about to begin. And if everything went according to plan, Margaret Wellington would never suspect that beneath the Chen family's perfectly regulation-compliant driveway lurked the neighborhood's most spectacular act of rebellion. For 2 months, the Chen family's car elevator operated flawlessly. Thomas had programmed 3 separate key fobs, one for each family vehicle with unique codes that activated the hydraulic system. The elevator had quickly become part of their daily routine, a source of both practical benefit and subversive joy. The neighbors who were in on the secret took vicarious pleasure in watching cars seemingly vanish from Thomas's driveway. A few had even begun making casual inquiries about the possibility of installing similar systems on their own properties. Thomas and Elijah had jokingly discussed starting a side business. Underground solutions, parking problems solved. But their streak of good fortune hit a snag on a muggy August afternoon, and Margaret Wellington's silver Mercedes pulled into Thomas's driveway unannounced. Thomas was in his home office when Sophia burst through the door, her voice tense with urgency. "Margaret Wellington is here. She's demanding to speak with you about water drainage irregularities." "What?" Thomas felt a cold spike of adrenaline. "Did she say anything specific?" "Just that Mrs. Patel next door reported water pooling along the property line after yesterday's storm. Margaret's saying it might be due to unauthorized modifications to our property." Thomas's mind raced. The drainage system for the underground garage directed excess water to a subtle French drain that ran along the property line, precisely where Mrs. Patel had apparently noticed pooling water. He'd need to deflect Margaret's suspicions without arousing new ones. "Where is she now?" Thomas asked, already moving toward the stairs. "Standing on her driveway taking pictures with her phone. The driveway is clear, thank God, but I didn't want to leave her alone out there." As Thomas approached his front door, he saw Margaret through the window, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with immaculately coiffed silver hair wearing the unofficial uniform of HOA presidents everywhere, khaki slacks, and a polo shirt with the neighborhood logo embroidered on the chest. She was methodically photographing the edge of Thomas's driveway where it met the lawn. "Margaret," Thomas called with forced cheerfulness as he stepped outside. "What surprise! How can I help you today?" Margaret straightened, her expression a mixture of suspicion and civic duty. "Mr. Chen, I'm here about a drainage complaint. Mrs. Patel reports that water has been pooling along your shared property line after rainstorms. This is unusual as we've never had drainage issues in this section of the neighborhood before." Thomas maintained a neutral expression. "I noticed that too, actually. I was planning to call a landscaper this week. I think it might be related to the city's recent work on the water main down the street. Several neighbors have mentioned similar issues." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Have they?" "I haven't received any other complaints." "Well, not everyone runs to the HOA with every little problem," Thomas replied, immediately regretting the edge in his voice. Margaret's gaze swept across his driveway, lingering on the nearly invisible seams of the elevator platform. "Your driveway looks different somehow." Thomas felt his pulse quicken but kept his voice steady. "I had it power washed and resealed last month. Regular maintenance, you know." Just then, Thomas heard the distinct sound of a car turning onto their street, the low electric hum of his Tesla. To his horror, he remembered that Mai had taken it to her summer job that morning and would be returning any minute. If she tried to activate the elevator with Margaret standing on the driveway, "Well, perhaps I should have a closer look at this drainage situation," Margaret was saying, already moving toward the side of the house. Thomas needed to distract her and get her off his property before Mai arrived. "Actually, Margaret, I've been meaning to talk to you about the community garden proposal for the common area. I have some thoughts on irrigation systems that might interest you." Margaret paused, momentarily diverted by one of her pet projects. "Oh, what sort of irrigation systems?" As Thomas launched into an elaborate description of drip irrigation technology, he caught sight of his Tesla turning onto their street. Through the windshield, he could see Mai, her attention divided between driving and what appeared to be her phone, probably selecting music. "Would you notice Margaret's car in time?" "Which could reduce water usage by up to 30%. Thomas continued, strategically positioning himself to block Margaret's view of the street while trying to catch May's attention with subtle hand gestures. The Tesla slowed as it approached their house. Thomas saw the moment when Mai spotted Margaret's Mercedes, her eyes widening in recognition. To Thomas's immense relief, she smoothly drove past their house without hesitation, giving a casual wave as if she intended to park elsewhere all along. Margaret, who had turned to see what Thomas was looking at, frowned slightly. "Was that your daughter? Where is she going?" "Probably her friend's house down the block," Thomas replied, his heartbeat gradually returning to normal. "Now about that community garden. Perhaps another time, Mr. Chen. I need to document this drainage issue before the light changes." Margaret moved purposefully toward the side yard. Thomas followed, grateful for the diversion from the driveway. The drainage issue was real and would need addressing, but it was a far less damaging discovery than the car elevator would have been. As Margaret took photographs and made notes on her clipboard, Thomas silently vowed to improve the drainage system that night. It had been their first close call, but he suspected it wouldn't be the last. An hour later, after Margaret had finally departed with a warning about further investigation pending, Thomas received a text from Mai. "Parked at Zoe's house. Is the coast clear?" Thomas smiled as he replied, "All clear. Operation Elevator lives another day." When Mai returned home, the family gathered in the kitchen to debrief on their narrow escape. Fall arrived in Oak Ridge Heights with spectacular foliage and the annual HOA inspection. Each October, the neighborhood board conducted thorough property reviews, noting violations and issuing compliance deadlines before the holiday season. For Thomas, this meant ensuring their secret remained undiscovered during the most intensive scrutiny of the year. The week before the inspection, Thomas, Elijah, and Lee Wai performed a complete maintenance check on the elevator system. They tightened hydraulic connections, recalibrated the sensors, and added a new feature, a smartphone alert system that May and her friend Jason had developed. The app now sent push notifications whenever someone approached the driveway, allowing family members to avoid activating the elevator when visitors were present. "This is impressive," Lai commented as they tested the updated system. "Your daughter could have a future in security technology." "Don't encourage her," Thomas laughed. "She's already talking about adding voice control and facial recognition to improve user experience." The day of the inspection arrived with perfect autumn weather. Thomas had strategically scheduled a work-from-home day, keeping all 3 cars off the property. The elevator platform remained in its surface position, appearing identical to any standard driveway. Margaret Wellington and 2 other board members appeared precisely at the scheduled time, clipboards in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," Margaret greeted him with professional coolness. "We'll try not to take too much of your time." The inspection proceeded methodically. Thomas followed at a respectful distance as the team examined his home's exterior, noting with satisfaction their approving nods at his meticulously maintained property. When they reached the driveway, Thomas held his breath. Margaret paused, her eyes sweeping across the concrete surface. "I see you've addressed the drainage issue we discussed." "Yes," Thomas replied. "I installed a new drainage system along the property line. Mrs. Patel has confirmed it solved the problem." Margaret made a note on her clipboard, then did something unexpected. She crouched down and ran her finger along one of the nearly invisible seams of the elevator platform. "Interesting," she murmured. "I don't recall this seam being here during our last inspection." Thomas kept his expression neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "It's always been there. That section was poured separately when the previous owners widened the original driveway." Margaret gave him a long, penetrating look before finally standing. "Well, everything appears to be in order, Mr. Chen. Thank you for your cooperation." As the inspection team moved on to the next house, Thomas texted Sophia, "Inspection complete. Close call with the seams, but I think we're clear." That evening, as Thomas recounted the inspection to Elijah over beers in his garage, his neighbor seemed unusually contemplative. "You know," Elijah said finally, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to bring a few more neighbors into our little secret." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that risky? The more people can know." "Hear me out," Elijah interrupted. "What we've created here isn't just a parking solution. It's a statement. It's proof that homeowners can innovate within the spirit of HOA regulations while technically remaining compliant." Margaret Wellington would disagree. "Exactly," Elijah said, leaning forward. "And that's the point. HOA has become so focused on maintaining control that they've forgotten their original purpose, to preserve neighborhood quality while allowing homeowners reasonable freedom." Thomas considered this. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we turn our rebellion into a revolution. Quietly, of course." The next day, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Barbara Patel, his next-door neighbor who had reported the drainage issue. She arrived with a plate of homemade samosas and an unusual request. "Thomas, I need to ask you something," she said after they were seated in his kitchen. "My nephew is staying with us while he attends graduate school, and now we have 3 cars but only a 2-car garage." Thomas nearly choked on his samosa. "That sounds challenging." Barbara leaned closer, lowering her voice despite being inside Thomas's house. "Ravi, that's my nephew. He says he saw your car disappear into your driveway one morning when he was jogging. He thought he was hallucinating until he saw it happen again yesterday." Thomas set down his food, mind racing. Ravi must have witnessed the elevator in operation during one of the family's comings or goings. The new alert system hadn't detected him, probably because he'd been on the sidewalk rather than approaching the driveway directly. "Barbara, I'm not sure what—" "Please," she interrupted. "I reported the drainage issue to Margaret because I genuinely thought there was a problem. I had no idea you had built," she gestured vaguely, "whatever it is you've built. But Ravi is studying civil engineering and he's absolutely fascinated. He's been talking about residential hydraulic applications nonstop." Thomas studied Barbara's earnest expression. She had lived next door for 5 years, had always been a kind neighbor, and had even testified against one of Margaret's more ridiculous property violation claims at a board meeting last year. Making a decision, Thomas stood up. "Would you like to see it?" Barbara's eyes widened. "Very much." 10 minutes later, Barbara stood in Thomas's underground garage, gazing around in wonder as the elevator platform hummed back into place above them, sealing them in the concealed space. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, as if afraid Margaret might somehow hear them 15 feet underground. "And Margaret has no idea?" "Not yet," Thomas replied. "But I'm beginning to think that keeping it a complete secret might not be the best approach anymore." Barbara considered this. "You know, the annual HOA board elections are coming up next month. Margaret is running unopposed for her 6th term as president." "As usual," Thomas nodded. "But what if she wasn't unopposed this time?" Barbara's eyes gleamed with sudden inspiration. "What if the neighborhood had an alternative, someone who understood the balance between regulations and innovation?" Thomas blinked. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "All I'm saying," Barbara replied with a growing smile, "is that people who can find creative solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems might make excellent community leaders." As they ascended back to the surface via the concealed stairway, Thomas found himself considering a possibility he had never imagined, transforming his act of personal rebellion into something bigger, a campaign for neighborhood change. That night, as the Chen family gathered for dinner, Thomas shared Barbara's suggestion. To his surprise, both Sophia and Mai responded with immediate enthusiasm. "You absolutely should run," Sophia declared. "The HOA needs new blood and new thinking. And you could use the car elevator as your campaign showpiece," Mai added excitedly. Imagine Margaret's face when she realizes what you've built right under her nose. Thomas laughed. It's not that simple. If I reveal the elevator before winning the election, Margaret could make our lives miserable, maybe even force us to remove it. Then don't reveal it yet, Sophia suggested. Run on a platform of